All right, we might get started, assuming that technology will work. So, welcome everyone to, I think it's about the 5th MSDI seminar series presentation. Before we introduce our speaker and her topic, just like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on the land where we gathered today and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Today we have a speaker, Sarah Kneebone, who is very familiar to us. She came to Behaviour, I think, in about 2012 and has been with us ever since. It's a true case of you can start but you never leave, so
can't get rid of them.
Sarah's got her doctorate late last year, looking at behavioural choice and selection, and she's going to talk today about catalytic behaviours, particularly under the topic of accelerating change for sustainable development. So, Sarah, welcome. Speak for about half an hour. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, but we do need to leave this room by about 5 to 2. So we'll kick you all out. Anyway.
Thanks,
Sarah.
Thank you. Ooh. 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 Hi everyone. Oh, it's got really infinite.
Yeah.
Cool. It's like an album cover. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Don't worry, the free cakes are just outside. The reason for coming along. I'm kidding. Thanks for coming. I was just saying to Liam, I feel like I've got a sense of deja vu because I've actually sort of been up here and stood up here and explained the topic, not dissimilar, 3 times through my milestones, through my doctorate. So, but this is the final bit, right? This is the outcome. So you won't necessarily have heard this before. This is what I actually found out at the end of the thesis, at the end of finishing writing it. And the reason why it's interesting, and I think one of the reasons why I've been invited to speak, is because there is implications for the broader sustainable development remit with some of the methods and approaches that I used. Do you mind just turning the air on? Just around, yeah, thanks. So I'll just run you through today, so we've got about half an hour or so. We'll have a look at what the potential is for spillover as a technique or a phenomenon or an approach for behaviour, and how adopting one behaviour can lead to additional adoption of further behaviours. So we'll also in that mention some of the mechanisms that have been proposed around spillover and how those psychological mechanisms means that similarity might be an important component of understanding which behaviours might be catalytic and which ones would not be. And then we'll look at a potential method whereby we can actually identify these catalytic behaviours or pathways for catalytic behaviours. Quick segue. I realise many of you, this is like teaching grannies suck eggs. I just thought I'd demonstrate to you, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Behaviour works method, because this topic fits in very tightly to one of the important segments of the Behaviour works method. So I know many of you will have seen this before. So this is an approach that we use at Behaviour works. We've used this on about 300 projects over the past few years, and we developed this a couple of years ago, and it really is the framework by which we actually run and design programs with our industry partners. So there's 3 main elements. First of all, there's exploration, and this is really about understanding what the bigger picture is, thinking about whether the problem is different for different groups, thinking about the existing evidence and what that tells us about the issue, and then identifying what the relevant behaviours are that would help address the problem at hand. So for sustainability, if we understand what the problem is, who are the key players involved, and then what are the behaviours, who do we want to do what differently in order to help address the problem. And where do we focus our attention? And then we go into the deep dive, which is really getting to grips with those individual behaviours, those priority behaviours. And we look at things like what are the drivers and barriers, what are the preventers and enablers for people to adopt those key behaviours. What has been tried before? What does the evidence say? What does the literature say? And then what kinds of interventions could we design? What might it look like? What would work in this area? How can we apply it and implement intervention design? And then finally looking at application, which is about trialing and testing our intervention, seeing whether it works, seeing whether it has the desired effect, or whether it has some negative effects, and then trialing, piloting, testing, modifying, adapting, and improving, and then learning from what we've done and sharing the learnings across whether it's industry or into academic journals, through various channels. Particularly thinking about how can we embed this form of thinking and form of designing and structuring programs into the organisation that we're working with. As a quick segue. And my work particularly ties into this area about identifying priority behaviours. When we have a whole series of behaviours that we could think about or consider to develop interventions for, how do we select which is the best one to go for? So back to the water saving and catalytic behaviours. Come back to it. So this was the basis of my thesis, this understanding that given the water situation, and the thesis really started fairly soon after the Millennium Drought finished. So the context of the time was very much just coming out of a drought situation. You've got high urban population, you've got high reliance on water. There had been a lot of water behaviour changes through the drought period, and we've got a situation whereby supply and demand are of course closely interwoven, and how do we ensure that we can manage demand in a sustainable way. And so a lot of the learnings from the project, from my thesis, really around management of resources, management of limited resources. This is why I think it could be applicable more broadly. I was looking at it in a water context, but equally a lot of the learnings you could apply to things like energy or other scarce resources. So we're in a situation whereby we might want to consider additional tools to facilitate demand management of water resources. This was the consumption of water in Australia pre, during and post-drought. And so you can see there was a huge decrease in household water consumption, and that was largely brought about through a huge variety of means. There was campaigns, and well, you probably remember who was in Australia during the drought. Yeah, right. There was campaigns, there was restrictions, there was policy brought in place, there was subsidies, there were all sorts of different schemes. And it was really a case of throw everything at the issue. It was such an important issue, throw everything at it, which means afterwards we have no idea what worked. So next time we're in a drought situation, we're just going to have to do the same thing again, throw everything at it. But it was very successful. And those changes were brought about through encouraging people to adopt all kinds of different behaviours. Now I went, and so the question is, well, which behaviours? So I went and talked to industry professionals from the water industry, and I went to the literature. I was like, okay, well, which behaviours was it? What were people doing? What were people being encouraged to do during the drought? And generally, if you want people to save water and conserve water around the home, what would you get people to do? And this is what we found out. Well, this wasn't all of them. This is only 46. We had a long list of, I think, over 100. And then we got the industry professional to sort of narrow it down as to the ones they thought were most relevant or most salient or most important in the Australian context, in the household context. So we ended up with this great big long list of 46 different potential behaviours that we could look at. Well, that's a lot. I'm one PhD student, and for PhD students it's very important to narrow down your research. So why do we prioritise? Well, is this a familiar image to anyone? Does anyone have Netflix at home? Who has Netflix? Okay, so when this page comes up, what do you do? What are your behaviours around this page? What do you do next?
Freak out.
You freak out.
Spend a whole movie's worth of time looking at which one.
Do you scroll? Who does the scrolling? Do you scroll? I scroll. Do a bit of scrolling. Does anyone else scroll? Scroll. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And then what do you pick? Something you've already seen. Or in my case, you give up after about 10 minutes and go to bed. Because I have that good of a life, yes. So we can become, this is what is known as choice overload. We can become overwhelmed by choice. Capitalism wonderful thing that capitalism is. It says more is more. More is better, and as consumers we should be offered choice, and we should have a range of choices, and the more choices that we have, the better it is for us. But we actually know from some interesting work that came out of the 90s and early 2000s, you get this choice paradox, and actually when we're presented with a huge range of choices, it paralyzes us. It's actually not as good for our well-being as capitalism would tell us. Oh, capitalism's wrong, fancy that. I know that will come as a shock to many of you. And when researchers have looked at choice, when shoppers have been presented with samples, 24 samples of jam versus 6 samples of jam, who do you think ended up buying the most jam after being presented with samples? The people with 6. So if you give people a choice of 6 jams, they're much more likely to buy jam than if you give them a choice of from 24 samples of jam. So choice is not always good. So we can get choice overload through this sort of paralysis. Consumers also tend to select the easy option. You know, if you have a big long list of pro-environmental, pro-social behaviours, what will people go for? The easy ones. They're not necessarily always the ones that you want them to go for. They may not be the ones that have the most impact or the most effect on your issue. In addition, we have a limit to our resources. We've only got so much time or money or personnel or will to look at these particular behaviours, and 46 is a lot. Over 100 is a lot. What was it for Townsville Energy? It was over 240 behaviours for energy saving around the home. And we really need to get that very detailed understanding of behaviours in order to understand the drivers and barriers, in order to design effective interventions. So we need to prioritise. So this was a tool that we developed within the thesis. It was actually, Liam, was it your idea or did you steal it from someone else?
I think it's safe to go with the latter.
Okay, he's quiet, so you know. So the point being that you can prioritise behaviours on a number of different criteria. So this is not necessarily new. What's new is putting it into the matrix, really. So you can prioritise behaviours on basis of things like the impact on the issue and the likelihood of adoption. And people have done this before, but traditionally with a score. So you end up with a total score, and then you end up with a ranked system. By having it on a two-dimensional matrix, it allows it to be a little bit more nuanced in your decision making, in your selection. And then you can actually layer additional data on top, which I'll get onto. So you start off with thinking about, well, how likely is my target audience to adopt this behaviour? Low to high, and of course you can have a scale along here. And what's the impact on the issue? Is it going to have a low total impact if people adopt it, or is it going to have a high impact? How far is it going to go to solving the issue? So if you've got behaviours that are low likelihood of adoption, low impact on the issue, probably hard for people to do, fairly ineffective, not necessarily going to be something that you want to be promoting, spending resources on. If you've got something that's low likelihood of adoption, so it might be quite hard to do, but has high impact on the issue, well, that's quite interesting. So that might tell us that behaviours that you end up mapping into this quadrant, they could be a potential target, but they might require additional resourcing. So the behaviours that your target audience might not automatically do, but if they did do them, it would have a big effect. High likelihood of adoption, low impact on the issue. So these are things that may be quite easy, people can engage with quite simply, but they don't achieve an awful lot. And in the pro-environmental space or pro-social space, we have to be really aware of these behaviours. Firstly, if we are promoting them, think about the rationale for that. It's all very well encouraging people to turn off a light switch, but if they then jet to Europe 5 times a year, you're not going to get the carbon savings that you might hope you were. But you could maybe use those to help leverage additional behaviours, and that's the point that I'll get to later. And the low-hanging fruit are those that are fairly easy for people to do. They're high likelihood of adoption, high impact on the issue. They're the those are your ideal priority behaviours. But because they're so good, they may well have been targeted previously. So if you've got a high proportion of people already doing them, you've got 90% of people doing them, is it worth getting that extra 10% across the line? Maybe, depends how good it is. But also you need to consider that, how many people are already doing them. So So I wanted to construct one of these for myself with those 46 water-saving behaviours. So in order to create one of these priority matrices, you have to collect data. So I went back to the water professionals, but I also went to the householders. And I asked the water professionals and the householders about how they viewed the behaviours in terms of the impact on water saving from the water professionals, because I thought they would probably have a better idea. And then the householders, I actually asked them how easy these behaviours would be for them to engage with, because ease is really a proxy for likelihood of adoption. And I asked them about their perceptions of the physical cost, the cognitive effort, and the physical effort involved in adopting the behaviours. And these two combined sources of data allowed me to build the matrix. And then in addition, we had another survey with householders asking them about current participation rates so that we could then overlay that onto the prioritization matrix. So that built our matrix. So we've now got all our behaviours mapped onto the 4 quadrants, so we know which are our high priority, which are high likelihood, high impact, low likelihood, high impact. Using that combination of data from the householders, data from the water professionals. So that gives us our start point, right? That helps us with our decision making. It gives us some early indications. And you could do this with any time you've got a long list of data. You could actually, long list of behaviours, you could actually do this. If you were able to collect the data, you could make your own prioritization matrix. But that's not quite far enough to get a PhD. So then I overlaid it with the data from the second survey, which was asking people about participation rates. And that was quite interesting. The circle size indicates participation rates. Well, it actually illustrates opportunity. So small circle size has got low opportunity, which means there's high existing participation. Large circle size mean that there's a lot of opportunity because there's not much existing participation. So these are the kinds of behaviours, these big circles are the kinds of behaviours that we might want to consider targeting, because not many people are doing them. It may be something that's novel. It's something that people aren't doing. These, as predicted, those low-hanging fruit behaviours, the high impact, high likelihood of adoption, already have good participation rates. They already have a high level of participation. So you may not want to spend additional resources promoting them further. But where you may want to put some resources is promoting some of these behaviours that not so many people are engaging with. They're harder to do, but they've got a high impact on the issue. So that gives you another layer to inform your decision making about which is our priority behaviour. Not quite far enough for a PhD. So then thinking about spillover. Now spillover is this idea that adoption of one behaviour can encourage adoption of additional or further behaviours spontaneously, virtually spontaneously, through things like psychological mechanisms like changes in perception or learning, changes in self-efficacy, whether you think you can engage with the behaviour, a desire for consistency or to avoid dissonance, where you want to perform something because it shows that to yourself that it aligns with something that you're already doing. So you maintain this feeling of consistency. Most people like to feel consistent. Cognitive dissonance theory is around that. It suggests that there might be greater efficacy between similar behaviours that are seen as similar. But there's not been very much work done on these similarity judgments. So water saving might involve, as you'd see, a huge range of different behaviours. Well, which ones are similar? Well, the interesting thing about similarity, and this is the spillover mechanism, sorry. So if you've got your first, for example, pro-environmental behaviour, a lot of the spillover work has been in the pro-environmental behaviour space. If you've got your first behaviour, the idea is if you perform that, in the performing of that, you will actually have changes in yourself and your psyche around your goals. So as you engage in a behaviour towards a goal, it actually strengthens your desire to continue towards that goal. It could have some shift in your identity, how you see yourself. I am the kind of person who recycles, or I'm the kind of person who donates to orphanages, therefore I am more likely to do more of that in the future. Can shift your skills and knowledge. If you need particular knowledge and skills to perform a behaviour, if you learn them through a first behaviour, you're more likely to do a second behaviour. And your self-efficacy. If you're able to perform one behaviour, then you can see yourself as being more competent, more able, with greater capability and capacity to perform a second behaviour. So these are just ideas. Some of these are being tested at the moment in the literature. The thing about perceptions of similarity, so if you've got, the idea being that if you've got behaviour 1 is similar to behaviour 2, then you might get more of this happening than if they're not similar. The issue with similarity is very much in the eye of the beholder. So in biology, which is my background and Liam's background, in biology we see this all the time with convergent evolution. So just because two organisms look similar doesn't mean at one level they're very similar, right? So they're both sort of round and prickly. So if your criteria for assessing similarity was whether something is round and prickly, then yes, these things are very similar. If you were looking at them genetically or from an ecological perspective, they're not similar at all. They don't even live in the same place. They're not even from the same part of the world. So it really depends what lens you're using to look at them. So two things can look very similar but be very dissimilar depending on your perspective. Equally, two things can look very dissimilar but actually be very similar. This is an elephant and its closest living relative, the hyrax. So if you were looking at it from a genetic perspective, very similar. If you're looking at it from an appearance perspective, not really. So similarity is really in the eye of the beholder. And a lot of the work that's gone on around spillover has been looking at behaviours and saying, okay, these are two pro-environmental behaviours, and so we will see spillover. We're expecting to see spillover. But it's very much from the researcher's perspective. And what I was really interested in, okay, researcher's perspective aside, how do the householders actually see these behaviours? So do they see turning off a tap inside the house as being similar to turning off the tap outside the house? Spoiler alert, no they didn't. So I used a sort procedure, which is a really fun research method, and I highly recommend it. It was really good fun. I had the behaviours on cards, and then I got people along and they had to organise them into groups. And as they were placing them into groups of similar behaviours that they saw as similar, I didn't give them any directions. I said it's completely up to you. I got them to explain why they thought they were similar. So I ended up with two bits of data. Behaviours placed together that were seen as similar, and then why they were being placed together. So they sorted them into groups, and I had the explanations for why they were seen as similar, and then I could do a content analysis on their explanations, which develops a list of principles, basically, or constructs. And then from the co-occurrence data, so which cards were being placed with each other most often, I could do a multi-dimensional scaling analysis, which is a really cool technique, and I was really impressed with myself that I was able to do it. But it was taught to me by Meredith Dobby, who is another researcher in the CRC for water-sensitive cities, and she used it with images. So this technique has been used a lot before, looking at things like architecture, landscapes, visual things. It's also used a lot in the food space. So I either was looking at research about landscapes or about people's consumer preferences for brandy or apples or chocolate, because it's used a lot in that sort of consumer perception space. Which of these two brandies is most similar to each other? They all taste the same. Anyway, similarities in the eye of the beholder. And by combining those two sets of data, the constructs and the similarities, I could build another matrix. There's a lot of matrices in my work. So this was this is what I came up with the constructs. I ended up with these like super constructs, and these were the main topics that my subjects used to discern between behaviours. Is it a curtailment behaviour? They didn't use the word curtailment. They used words like habitual, daily, regular, frequent, weekly. But they all mean curtailment. They're all behaviours that you do to reduce your water use, but on a regular basis, things like turning off the tap. So they group together. Behaviours that took place outside, as opposed to behaviours that took place inside the home, behaviours that took place outside the home. And then sort of maintenance and efficiency behaviours. Again, my words, not theirs. So maintenance was about fixing things, checking systems, fixing leaks, anything about maintaining the systems of the home. And efficiency, these are the one-off behaviours. These are installing a dishwasher, water-efficient dishwasher, installing a water-efficient washing machine, installing a water tank in the garden. And then from the co-occurrence data, which cards were put together most frequently, that produced this, what was it called? Multidimensional scaling analysis matrix. So the closer together the behaviours are, the more similar they're seen to be. And the further apart they are, the less similar they're seen to be. So you end up with clusters. And I determine this is another beauty of this technique. I determine the clusters then. So I got the blobs in the space, and then I drew the clusters around them. And I drew those clusters from also using the constructs diagram as well. So I ended up with this matrix. So this shows which behaviours are seen as similar, which behaviours co-occurred, and why they're seen as similar. So not just what are seen as similar, but why they're seen as similar. What are the constructs that people were using, similarities in the eye of the beholder, what constructs people were using to determine whether behaviours were similar or not. You can overlay this data with the prioritization matrix. Ready for this? This is like, I know, this is like 4 years worth of work in one diagram, which is both cool and irritating. So you end up seeing from the prioritization matrix, you can see which of these behaviors on the prioritization matrix are actually seen as similar. So these are the ones that you could actually leverage one from another. So because if two behaviors are seen as similar, we might be more likely to get that catalytic, that spillover effect. And the reason this is beneficial is because we can then take people on a journey, right? So if they're starting off with something that they see as being very easy to do, very simple to do, high likelihood of adoption, but low impact, we can use that really as a start point to encourage them on a journey to ones that are maybe harder to do, like these ones. They're all seen as very similar. If you start them off with installing a system weight, can you then encourage them to put in the low flow shower head, and then a dual flush toilet, and then a rain tank for irrigation? Because all of those behaviours are seen as similar. Can you lead them on this journey? You can add this in then to the opportunity, the existing participation rate data, and add it in again. So again, we can move people along on this journey from behaviours that a lot of people are doing. So we know most people are already taking shorter showers, filling the washing machine. Can we take them on a journey to adopt something that's harder to do but more impactful, or they would be less likely to do, or fewer people are already doing? Can you move them from having a low flow shower head to installing a rain tank in the home? Because they're seen as similar. They're seen as similar. Can we move people along this journey? Ideally going from the low impact, high likelihood, or the high impact, high likelihood, in towards the high impact, low likelihood behaviours that not many people are doing. If we can get more people doing those behaviours, we might have a real impact on the issue. So these are the potential pathways that we could take people along. So there's this idea of the virtuous escalator. Once people get on at the bottom, can we encourage them on this journey to go to increase the effectiveness or impact of their behaviours by going from similar behaviour to similar behaviour to similar behaviour? Remembering that the similarity means that hopefully, from a spillover perspective, they'll be getting some of those psychological mechanisms, those shifts in identity, or increasing self-efficacy, or increasing skills and knowledge more by using two similar behaviours than if it was just two random pro-environmental behaviours like recycling and public transport. So we ended up with this sort of potential virtuous escalator. So we start people off with these simple behaviours that we know most people are doing, like composting kitchen scraps, getting them to do something slightly more difficult, like collecting shower warm-up water, to using a broom instead of a hose to clean outside spaces. So all of these behaviours were seen as similar by our participants in the study, and they get sort of higher impact, lower likelihood of adoption as you move along. grouping plants with similar water needs together, using mulch, planting native plants, and then installing the drip irrigation system. They're all seen as similar. So spillover suggests that maybe we can encourage them along this pathway. So just to summarize, we know that prioritization for target behaviours is really important. We've got limited resources. We don't want to risk choice overload in our target audience. We know that decision-making tools can help us select those. Something like the impact likelihood matrix is a useful start. Not enough for a PhD though. It's a useful start just in order to assess behaviours in terms of the impact on the issue and how likely the target is to adopt them. We also think we know that spillover effect could be an interesting way of leveraging additional behaviour change, additional behaviour adoption through the use of these catalytic behaviours. And this is what is really exciting and interesting from a much broader perspective. This is just one context in water, but when we're looking across sustainable development, you could apply it to other resource, other demand management behaviours, a huge range of consumer behaviours, a massive range of different behaviours. You know, if we understand what our target audience sees as being similar, then maybe we can try and use this spillover effect. And the mechanisms do suggest that similarity could play a role. This is a really under-researched area, so there's still lots of work to be done out there. And maybe by combining those perceptions with that impact likelihood matrix data, we can create some sort of virtuous escalator. So we end up with a pathway that we guide people along. So they start off by turning the light switch off, and they end up by selling up and moving to a hut in the Dandenongs. I don't know. You know, so you end up with taking, yes, for example, or somewhere really out the back of beyond, like Healesville, I don't know. So you end up, you know, trying to encourage people from going from a, you know, big ecological footprint to a much smaller ecological footprint through the choices that they're making. We can map out, if my method is correct, we could map out the way that we could take people. We could map out which behaviours should help encourage which other behaviours and try and guide people along that pathway. And remembering, of course, that similarity and perceptions of similarity, it's not up to us as researchers, it's really down to the target audience. We have to go to where they are. There's no point really, and this is, you know, what you do see a lot in the literature is this understanding that these are all pro-environmental behaviours. We as pro-environmental behaviour researchers see them all as similar. It doesn't really matter what the target audience thinks. I mean, you know, so I do wonder if some of the not so good results that have been found in the spillover literature so far are a result of that. Been trying to leverage one behaviour off another when those two behaviours have just not been seen as being connected by the target audience. That said, this all needs to be tested. So I didn't get that far. A PhD only requires you to go a certain distance, so it wasn't actually tested. So it all needs to be tested, and as I say, spillover is still a relatively new field, and there is still work going on in it, but it's certainly an interesting area, and it's something that we maybe can apply at a much broader scale and much greater range of contexts. Thank you very much. Any questions? Thanks, Lim.
Thank you, Sarah. Don't go far. We do have about 15 minutes of time for questions. You can just wait a second. Well, actually, you can. I just did actually want to just make sure that the people online could hear all that. Didn't check at the start. I assume by virtue of the fact that they weren't typing furiously to you, Amy, that they could hear it. So perhaps I'll start with a couple of questions in the room. But those of you who are dialing in via Zoom, I'll turn to you after the first couple of questions. First one from Mark.
So the question was prompted by your comment about someone engaging in a virtuous behaviour, and then I think you said, and then booking a couple of holidays overseas. Because a lot of your similarity testing was around positive environmental behaviours. Is there, with regards to spillover, is there equal risk of people clustering behaviours, both good and bad? Like, okay, so you put in, say, drought-tolerant turf, and then you go out and buy a couple of, you know, ornamentals from overseas that require you to water the shit out of them.
Yeah.
So has that been looked at all? I'm assuming obviously you didn't look at it, but has that been looked at kind of spillover with regards to negative, so you can't actually build a virtuous escalator, you just end up with a nebulous flat line. You know what I mean?
Yes, there is the dark side to spillover. My work was only looking at positive spillover, because I'm an optimist. Thank you, thanks Amy. But there is also the existence of its evil twin negative spillover, which is about, which relates to the fact that people doing one behaviour, that means that they actually don't do any more behaviours, or the next behaviours that they do are negative behaviours. So you have the, it's instantly lost. Rebound effect, thanks so much, whereby, for example, we see this with some installation behaviours, and there was a really good study in, I think it was in Sweden somewhere, and it was looking at people who bought electric vehicles in order to reduce their environmental footprint, but actually they didn't change their mileage at all. So they bought their electric vehicle for environmental reasons, but then they didn't actually reduce their vehicle use. And we see it, we see it a lot with the installation behaviours. When you install, for example, an energy efficient device, you end up using it more. And you also have the virtue, what's the virtue one? When you do a positive behaviour, and then that gives you moral licensing, thank you memory, moral licensing to then do something negative. So this is what supermarkets do, this is why you have fruit and vegetables at the beginning of the supermarket, because you fill your trolley with your fruit and vegetables, and that gives you moral licensing to then go down those middle aisles and pick up chips and chocolate and all the other crap that they sell. Yeah, or squash your raspberries. So it's negative in more ways than one. So yeah, so there is the evil twin of the negative spillover is definitely possible.
Thanks. Sarah, you said that you could see application here in situations where we're dealing with very scarce resources. What about different types of behaviour change situations where we want to stop people from doing bad stuff like smoking or controlling their partners in an abusive way? Is there research that suggests that spillover effect applies there, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I say, spillover has really come out of the pro-environmental behaviour field. So a lot of it has really focused on some of those pro-environmental behaviours around consumer decision making and transport use and recycling and waste management and things. But you know, certainly if similarity is important, and if the spillover effect is a genuine phenomenon, which is still under discussion really, then you know, I don't see why not. You would just have to be really clear about what your behaviours are, and then what the relation of those behaviours are to each other, and how the target audience sees it. You know, something like smoking cessation, there's a whole series of different behaviours that you could engage with to promote smoking cessation, but they're quite different. You know, going and buying Nicorette patches is quite different to phoning a quit helpline, that's my perception, to, you know, undergoing hypnotherapy. They all have the same outcome ultimately, but are they seen as similar? And if not, then it might not be such a useful tool.
There's one question I've got on Zoom from Stefan. Alright, so Stefan asks, do you have any sense of the repeat measure validity of similarity clustering within groups and cross groups? I.e., would the same people consistently group the same behaviours across two different measures, or would two nominally similar groups of people consistently group behaviours in the same way?
That's a great question, Steph. The answer is I don't know, because to do my doctorate I only had to go so far and then I didn't have to go any further. But yeah, that's a really good question. So I do not know if people are consistent. So a good way, to look at this, we would have to really check and see whether people were being consistent in how they were assessing behaviours. It might be that they were just having a very outdoor similar behaviour day, and so therefore they were putting the behaviours in those clusters because that's just how they were feeling that day, but it has no relationship to how they actually feel over time. So yes, it would have to be repeated. And it was a very narrow specific context. I was only working with people who were living in Melbourne. And it may be that people see behaviours differently depending on the environmental context in which they live. So if you're in Perth, you might see those outdoor behaviours as being very different to how people in Melbourne saw them. So yeah, it was very context specific.
You had one follow-up. Was the grouping done in an individual or group setting?
No, in an individual setting. Yeah, so there's no impact on individual assessment by other individuals. Yeah, so it was an individual setting.
He says cool.
Cool to you too, Steph.
Thanks, Steph, for asking that question, because that was part of my question. So, Sarah, this is really impressive and amazing work. Great to get a bit more detail around behavior change, because we don't often hear about it enough in some ways. I feel like I should go to a few more of your offerings.
You should.
I was curious about that group interaction, and I'm also curious about different models for testing, because we know, well, I don't know, but I would imagine, how does this translate to the organizational setting? How does it translate to sort of behavior of businesses, or mobilizing groups within businesses, or mobilizing groups within communities? So I guess I'm just looking for your thoughts on how did the question around, did the groupings happen individually? But we know that, for example, in my passion area, people shop together. What other behaviors of other people in their shopping habits and how much they consume clothing and how they use clothing is very much influenced by
others.
behavior. So I'm curious of your thoughts on sort of next steps and how does it apply if you also to working in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really interesting point. And I think Paul was talking about it in his presentation the other day, which was about the individual level versus the household level behaviours, because I was looking very much at an individual level, individual perceptions of similarity, individual perceptions of impact and effort involved in participating in the behaviours. But we know from what it was Paul saying it the other day, wasn't it, that actually, for water consumption, it happens at a household level. So it's not just about the choices of the individual, it's about the choices of the household. And so there has been less work done at that level. So as soon as you start extrapolating up from the individual, I don't think you could extrapolate from the individual. You would have to look at it at a different organisational level altogether, because we know that there are some interactivities and interactions going on there that we can't explain by just looking at the individual. Oh no, time's up for questions, what a shame.
I'll just ask this. I really like the presentation, Sarah, thanks a lot. And I'm interested in the spillover effect, and I understand the way you use the spillover effect is to understand how behaviors within an individual lead to spill over, that one certain behavior can change another behavior within the same individual. Of course, you can also think about spillover between people, and I wondered if your approach would also be suitable to understand that question more, so actually how behaviors can spill over and diffuse through larger groups of communities.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's a good.
As your former supervisor, Sarah, you need to answer that properly.
Yes, yeah, good question. I think you're right, and I think it relates to what Alicia was saying as well. Is as soon as we start involving more than the individual level, we need to start reconsidering our research methods and our approaches and how we collect that data and how we understand it. Because even with the things like the multidimensional scaling analysis and those analysis tools that I was using, they're all focused at the individual and at the individual perception. So as soon as you want to understand similarity as perceived by the group, or the family unit, the household, or the organisation, there would have to be other approaches to look at that. But then when you're thinking about spillover, then you'd be looking very much about the role that social norms come into play in terms of how we learn from others about appropriate behaviour. And certainly we know for water-saving behaviours in the household, those outdoor behaviours to some extent can be more powerful than the indoor behaviours because they're visible. So there has been some really interesting work done looking at the effect of outdoor visible water-saving behaviours on the neighbourhood scale as opposed to on the individual household scale. Because the things that are happening in the house, only the people, the immediate members of the family might notice them. Indeed, in some households, no other members of the household might notice them. And I'm looking to you, ladies. So there might be behaviours that you're engaging with that other people, even in the household, don't understand that you're engaging with. Whereas those outdoor behaviours are suddenly much more visible, and they could have a much greater effect through things like social norms than the indoor behaviours. So when we're considering impact, it might not just be in terms of that individual household reduction in water consumption, but at a neighbourhood scale. So things like the water tanks, those big installation, one-off, expensive, hard to do, they might actually be even more powerful than we initially consider using the prioritization matrix, because we haven't added on that social norming effect layer onto the assessment for our decision making. So I think it was Jeff Rose did some of that work on the social impact of outside behaviours, and he was one of my examiners. So in Tasmania, Jeff Syme, sorry, not Jeff Rose. He's a botanist. And there's a botanist. So it might be that there's another layer that we need to consider in our decision making if we're picking out our priority behaviours, is that social layer. What was also really interesting, and which I think was actually wrong in the data, was that both the householders that I asked and the water industry professionals, we ended up with going meat-free, going dairy-free behaviours in the easy-to-do, low-impact quadrant. So I didn't sense check any of this. I just took the data that was given to me by my study participants. I wasn't judging their data as right or wrong. On reflection, I think they're wrong. Because, changing your diet to reduce your meat consumption, reduce your dairy consumption is very hard to do, and we know that because it's a habitual behaviour, and we know that habitual behaviours are difficult to do. And we know from an impact level, if I just got all my participants to reduce their meat consumption, reduce their dairy consumption, that would have a much greater impact on water saving across the system than probably all of the other behaviours combined. So that was interesting as well. I could have taken that further. I didn't need to. But that was quite interesting. So the perceptions of some of these behaviours are actually erroneous. And that's interesting too. So society has these perception about these behaviours, which is not true. And that's something else that's worth considering when we're applying these sort of techniques and methods.
I had a question/comment, which is around the likelihood measure. And I think to Rob's point a little bit is that, if lots of people are doing things, then it kind of impacts likelihood, right? Is that the more people are doing it, the more likely they'll do it. So my question is, there's probably many criteria that you could scale on likelihood, and I'm interested in what you chose and how you did it specifically. I know you mentioned those three things, but there's just a bit more detail on that. But also what we didn't choose, because we discussed a lot, right, about likelihood.
Yeah, so likelihood of adoption, how likely the target audience was to adopt the behaviour. I used the perceived effort as a proxy. So I was actually measuring how difficult the target audience thought the behaviour was to do. And I used the three measures for that: the financial cost, the physical effort, and the mental effort, the cognitive effort, the thinking and planning involved in the behaviour. And then I took the highest rated of each of those and then used that as my likelihood score. However, as Liam says, likelihood is affected by a whole series of things. How frequent is it? How common is it in the population? What are the social norms coming into play? Perceptions of impact. How impactful you think the behaviour is will impact on the likelihood. The more impactful you see as a behaviour as being, the more likely you are to do it, which leads me to a horrible meta thing where my matrix sort of implodes on itself and a two-dimensional object becomes one-dimensional, and it's against physics. I can't do it. And Liam's done a lot of work as well with many years ago, I think it was, wasn't it, Liam, about your zoo work with the Nero framework. So that was that zoo visitors said that it was most important if a behaviour was new to them, if it was on-site, if it was, if they were self-efficacy, the easy, so that high level of self-efficacy, and what was the R? Oh, response efficacy. They saw it as being impactful. So there are a variety of different criteria that we could use to assess likelihood, basically. And likelihood itself is not actually very well understood. There's probably another PhD in that. I'm not doing it.
All right, I'm conscious of time. We have time for probably one last question online. Is there anyone online who would like to make, this is your last chance to ask Sarah a question for today? No? No more? Okay, well, can we all join in an applause for Sarah? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me.
It's a really cool PhD, and there's obviously lots more to do in that space, so I'm really excited and great to hear about it. Rob, do you want to talk about the next seminar series, or?
Yep, the next seminar series is on education, sustainability education, by Ellen Rye from our education department. And it's going to be a bit of a technological experiment as well, because at the same time we have a speaker from Canada, McKinsey, what's her first name? Marcia McKinsey. And they will do a duo presentation on a large project they've run around sustainability education and climate change and all that stuff.
And they're looking to collaborate with us, so
yeah, so please come along.
When is it?
2 weeks, 11th
2 weeks.
of April, I think. 11th of April.
Yeah. 11th.
I think so.
All right, on that note, get out.